Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am so happy to see all of your faces. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Anna Becker. I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Minneapolis Arts Association, NEMA. We are most well known for running Art World, but we're also a member organization, and we have about 1,000 members here in Northeast, which happens to be on Dakota and Ojibwe land. And our mission as an organization is to provide artists with resources, promotion, and fellowship. And one of the things that it's been pretty tough to provide in the last few years is the fellowship. So I'm so excited to see everyone here with us. I have the honor and the privilege to present this panel with the Mnisota Native Artists Alliance and to learn about this incredibly deeply important topic to the Native community. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to Graci Horne and the panelists.
Thank you, Anna. I'm Betty Washte, Graci Horne, Imachiapie, Sisseton, Wahpeton, Oyate, Naku, Hunkpapa, Oyate, Naku, Wahpekute, Oyate, Mitioshbe, Southside, Edwa T. Hello, my name is Graci Horne. I am a part of the Mnisota Native Artists Alliance. I would say about 6 months ago, I had a really awesome conversation with Anna. And she kind of is like the dream person to want to partner up with. She approached me and said, how can we support the Mnisota Native Artists Alliance? This was like right after Art World. And I said, well, one of our biggest things right now is facing appropriation. And she was like, I got it. We're going to do this panel discussion, and this is going to hit our artists, but we also want to just do some education. So we deeply, deeply appreciate you showing up, because the thing about racism, the thing about oppression, and the thing about prejudice is that oftentimes with our public school systems, it's not a part of the curriculum. It's left in your hands to do your own educating. And so oftentimes when people come to me and ask me questions, I will say, not too rudely, but I will say, did you Google yet? Did you educate yourself yet of this? Because when you're a young person, a person of color, or a Dakota woman, you're oftentimes in this position where you're exerting a lot of energy. And so tonight is your night where you are educating yourself about this issue that is definitely hurting our community in many faceted ways. So without further ado, I want to have my panelists, instead of reading off their biographies, because my background is in museum studies and it gets super dry, I always like to riff it, like let the audience know who you are instead of reading a bio. So I'd like to introduce Marlena Myles.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Marlena Myles. I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. I am from the Spirit Lake Dakota tribe in North Dakota. The work I create, it teaches about Dakota's significance to the land and uses the land as a teacher in the many art forms that I create. So I create augmented reality, I create murals, illustrations, children's books, and I even own a Dakota publishing company called Unkipi, which means we are capable, so that Dakota voices can be heard and we're able to promote our own culture.
Hello, there we go. Buju Asanawikwe Indigenous Ajujak and Dudame, Gawa Babiganikag and Dunjaba, San Antonio and Da. My name is Ashley Fairbanks. I'm from the White Earth Nation in northern Minnesota. I grew up on the south side, and I live in San Antonio, Texas, where it is much warmer than it is right now. I am a writer and an installation artist and a creative director, and I'm publishing my first children's book comes out next summer, Penguin Random House. I'm very excited. It's called This Land. It's about how all land on this continent is native land. It's very exciting. And I'm here, excited to be here today with some great people.
Yeah, and so on our program, we were supposed to have a third panelist, but we still are in a pandemic, and this person didn't have COVID but is sick. And so I am filling in for that person. So I'll be answering questions and moderating as well. So just keeping myself on my toes. So what is cultural appropriation? A term used to describe the taking over of creative art or artistic forms, themes, or practices by one cultural group from another. It is in general used to describe Western appropriation of non-Western or non-white forms and carries connotation of exploitation and dominance. And so kicking off our first question, what has been your experience dealing with appropriation? And I'll be beginning it with Marlena.
I mean, appropriation, the experience I've had with it, it's never been as direct as someone just not from my culture using Dakota symbolism in their art. It's usually a lot more complex than that. I've applied for calls for Native artists, and then when I get selected as a finalist, I look at what the other people are doing, and there are people who are not necessarily from the tribes in this area, and their sort of thing they're trying to do as their project is go to our tribes, take our stories and our experiences and create art using that. And I didn't think that was like appropriate to do, because those are our experiences and someone else is channeling it through their art forms. And there's been a lot of problems recently with non-Native people coming and collecting our stories and copyrighting those stories and selling them back to us or to other people, or depositing those stories into a university's library and sort of taking them away from us. And so appropriation, can exist in those kind of formats where you take our stories from my people and we lose our cultural property. I also do a lot of graphic design for people, and I tell them that there are tribes who are Dakota and Lakota who pass laws that copyright our symbols and our languages and everything as cultural property belonging to our whole community. So I tell them too that I can't let them have the copyright to my art. I can license it to them, but it still belongs to my people as a whole. The art that I create, it's not just my stories, it's the Dakota people's stories as well. So I have to be thoughtful about what I create and what is permissible to be sort of given away to non-Native organizations. So I think appropriation, can be very complex, and you really have to think about these sort of things as a Native artist. Are you being tokenized? Is someone using you to validate something being created by non-Native people? And then be able to speak up about the laws that exist, whether they're tribal laws or state law or federal law, that is supposed to protect our art forms. But Ashley can share some of her experiences.
Sure. I think that my journey with appropriation has been, like all of ours, a long one. Throughout the course of my life, I think the kind of appropriation that we're dealing with has changed. Sometimes you're shocked back into things that you're like, I thought we weren't doing that anymore. It's Halloween. Why are you wearing a tiger lily costume? So that's the base level appropriation, right? But I really do think that there's been this really weird sort of woke appropriation that has happened in the past few years, where it's everyone's indigenous to somewhere, and the indigenous has become a box that people want to check, and so they get to fill that with whatever they want to define as indigenous. And indigeneity is place-based, right? I'm just gonna correct the land acknowledgement too. This isn't Ojibwe land. This is Dakota land, and as the Ojibwe person at the table, I'll say that I'm not indigenous to this place. I'm indigenous to northern Minnesota and to Lake Superior, and living in San Antonio, I wouldn't take opportunities for indigenous artists there. That's not my place. And I think it's been really hard because we want to simultaneously say we don't honor colonial borders, but we also have to like do gatekeeping because we're already so under-resourced. Like we're really competing for. Thankfully, there's programs like MNAA and like people like Pamela out there like getting resources for our people, but we're competing for a really small pot. And so it's really hard to watch Native artists who've been working their entire lives lose out on opportunities to people who aren't Indigenous from here, be that from other places on the continent or from around the world. I've seen like a lot of art calls accept very broad definitions of what, does a Sami person who's like third generation Swedish deserve to take an opportunity for Indigenous people here? I don't think so. But I think those are hard conversations to have, and there's a lot of nuance, so.
Yeah, and for me, appropriation began really young. I was super young, but I was very blessed. When I was growing up, my mother was a singer. She produced her first album, like maybe when I was 7 or 8 years old, and this was doing Dakota traditional contemporary music. And I remember it vividly. I remember us meeting white woman who signed my mother, and my mother signing this contract, and life was good. Like life was, we were living in Moose Lake, Minnesota, in a nice house. We had a brand new Toyota van. Christmas was great. I remember being sent by limo to Minneapolis because my mom needed to record things, and it was great. And then all of a sudden, it was not so great. Our van was being repossessed, and my mom had just found out that she signed her whole record away to this person, her whole rights to it. And I remember being very young and not understanding the context of the situation of just not being in this home anymore, not having this nice van anymore, and being completely just back on welfare, I guess. And then for a number of years, I would say, like, when I was young, I would see my mom perform on a stage, and I felt really lucky because I was like, this is a Native person that I'm looking up to. I want to do this. Like, I want to perform. And then all of a sudden, she couldn't perform her own songs. And it wasn't until this person had passed away that her daughter made it right and gave back those rights to my mother. But I think from then, being a young person, being exposed to that, I realized our people really need to read when they sign those things away. They need to understand what our rights are. And unfortunately for us, the judicial systems and the policies that are in place are not written for us. They're not protective for us because we are community-based, like trademark or copyright, whereas the law here on our occupied land, we are occupied still, is that it needs to be an individual name. So if you are going to do anything about copyright infringement, it needs to be in that one person's name. And I think oftentimes we are kind of like hit with that, like blindsided with that, and we don't understand what that means. And that's pretty much why MNAA exists and why we've adopted this, to protect our native artists. I think when I was in my teen years, my parents in 2004 started to do stuff about cultural appropriation with ceremonies and sacred sites. And this was right after the Sedona, Arizona incident where many people died in a sweat lodge. And during that same time, we were getting a lot of calls about women and children that were getting in vulnerable situations from men that should not be running those types of ceremonies, or should not be, Native and non-Native, that were perpetrating young and vulnerable people. I think that's why now that I'm an adult, I don't give my power to anybody. I believe in my own prayer. I believe in my own self. I believe my connection to Creator, and I view that as being sacred. I don't go and try to find a guru, because oftentimes, not just with Native people, with other cultures, it's the same exact thing, where you can be totally vulnerable. You can not grow up with your people and you're trying to reconnect. And what do? You go find a medicine man or go find a person, and then this person either exploits you or exploits you for every different thing. And so I guess for me, cultural has affected my life in different facets and different forms. And now my whole job is with Minnesota Native Artists Alliance, which has only been kind of in existence since the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, it affected Native artists. All of us that were either teaching in person or doing a number of things, we were just in decline for those opportunities. And when those opportunities far and few between, and then you're also competing with non-Native people for contracts or for what have you, more complicated. And right now, I think the hard thing about that is oftentimes people don't understand what blood quantum means and why each tribe has blood quantum, and they want to mix up fraud, what is fraud and what is blood quantum. Blood quantum is something that we have to do with the United States. And when those two things get mixed up, then that's when it becomes like a gray area. And so things like this, what we're trying to do is educate people on knowing the difference, or just encouraging people to really understand what we're talking about and differentiate, because Minnesota Native Artists Alliance wants to organizations, institutions, and galleries in compliant with the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, but with just being good.
Graci,
laws can't do so much.
Can I explain something real quick for people who don't know a bunch of the terms that you just used?
Yes.
So I think I'll just give a very quick summary of I think what Graci's saying. Like, if you don't know anything about what blood quantum is or about any of the, our tribes all have the ability, the 567 recognized tribes in America have the ability to govern in a way that they govern themselves, right? We're domestic dependent sovereigns, so we have our own government structures, we elect our own leaders, and we create our own enrollment policies. So some tribes, the big news here in Minnesota is the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, which is all of the Ojibwe tribes, but one voted to get rid of blood quantum. So now we have lineal enrollment. But before then, you had to be at least 1/4 to be enrolled in any of our tribes. And so that's different for different tribes around the country, where their limits are. And so there's this thing where people are like, you can't exclude people who aren't enrolled, because there's a lot of reasons why people aren't enrolled. They could have been had parents that were adopted out, or grandparents that were adopted out, really just stolen from their people. There's lots and lots of valid reasons why people aren't enrolled, but things have gotten really complicated because there's who's reconnecting, who's enrolled, should we even acknowledge blood quantum? Should we and then how do you protect things? Because people are saying that they're anything, because people want to make money off of our ceremonies and our cultures. So it's really complicated, even for those of us who've been living this life our whole life, and to explain it to people, I think it's a lot to try to fit in really quickly.
Thank you for explaining that. Sometimes I wish people knew what blood quantum was. In your opinion, how does cultural appropriation affect Native people and communities?
I know for a lot of Native communities, making art is a way they support their families. It's also a way they support their communities by sharing knowledge with each other. And there are people who come to the reservation, they're interested in our spirituality, let's say. And so they meet with different elders and they start learning things. They're not Native, they're not Native American. And then all of a sudden, they want to start teaching these things themselves, and they don't get permission to do it. Or if they do, they shop around until somebody tells them, yeah, it's fine if you're doing it with a good heart. And then let's say like teaching medicines. A lot of Native people, when they create medicines, they don't charge money for it. They don't, it's our medicine isn't about making a profit. So they'll just do things for free to help other people. And then, the person who was sick or whatever will give them a gift, and it'll be sort of that way of honoring each other's time and energy that we gave to each other. But people who don't grow up in our culture, they don't understand that. And then suddenly I see a lot of non-Native people teaching our ceremonies or teaching about plant medicine to other non-Native people. And, they're making a profit, making a name for themselves. Some of them might even marry like a Native man or and take their last name. And so then it looks validated on paper without looking really in depth who this person is. And they make a whole career working for tribes or working for organizations that these opportunities were supposed to go for a Native person who, this knowledge would pass down through the generations to them. But somebody else just came in who didn't understand our way of living and the way that we share knowledge, and, kind of corrupted the whole system. Because some Native people, we are giving, we're generous, we don't want to have to be suspicious of everybody that comes to us, but it's starting to become apparent that our knowledge is being taken from us and other people are profiting from it, while many reservations in urban areas, people are living in poverty, and the money's not going towards us. So, I still see it happening. I make a career for myself as an artist, but when I work with organizations, I'm always direct with them that there's other people in the community who you might have hired in the past, but you shouldn't have hired them. You should have asked them more about who they really are, who are their relatives, what community they come from, because they're literally just going unchecked with what they're doing. So I see it happening in real time, people who profit from us.
I think just a kind of a different approach to this question than I've ever answered before, in that, like, I was presenting to the McKnight board on Thursday, and we were told this quote that Deanna Cummings had just learned, which was she was the guy who made Piss Christ, and started the NEA on fire, basically. He was presenting at this Grant Makers in the Arts conference, and he was talking about how people think that art is only supposed to be beautiful, and that so much of artists' roles actually to hold the pain of our communities, to hold the pain and the anger, and that you can't really just be people who make beautiful things and tell beautiful stories without also knowing that pain. And so when I think about the work that I do, it is deeply connected and rooted into my family's experience of trauma. My grandparents both survived boarding school. My dad lived in Minneapolis as Ames started and was beaten by his teachers because he was Native. And that is inseparable from the work I create. So what makes me the angriest about appropriation is it's people really getting their flowers when they don't deserve them. They don't have that connection. They don't have to experience that pain. My grandma was taken from her family when she was 5 years old and didn't see them again for 7 years. She was loaned out to white families in South Dakota, and I used to have to listen to her scream at night. She would scream in her dreams. And that is connected to my work. And that's what appropriation does. It's people telling our stories without knowing our pain. Scott Seekins did these Dakota ledger art pieces. And I was like, how fucking dare you? Yeah, he put himself in them like it was a comedy. And the worst thing is that the reaction when we get angry about these things is gaslighting us. is telling us that it's not worth being angry about. Like, Graci and I organized against the artist who put the scaffold in the Walker Art Center, sculpture garden. And Graci did all this work, and these elders were in so much pain, and people attacked us. Like, well-known artists attacked us for policing art. And it's like, you literally just made genocide a plaything. Like, so that to me, that's the essence of all this, right? Like, I really don't care about like what Halloween costumes people wear or like what shitty art they want to say is indigenous. What I care about is being stewards of our pain and of our love, because like everything we have, all of our traditions, they were our life rafts for our people. Like, they hung on to those things. And man, I just got one last story because it makes me so angry. Like, Ojibwe people, we live mostly in wigwams, and like every Ojibwe woman used to be able to weave rush mats. So they're mats out of the cattails, and that's like what was the foundation of the floor in our houses, and we used them to cover up our homes during different seasons. And we all used to know how to do these, and they would be decorative, and they were super beautiful. You can see a bunch of them. And I was working at the Historical Society, and I was like, how come no one can do this anymore? Like, why does anyone have this skill? And I looked at, like, I went around to all these different reservations. I talked to people, does anyone know how to weave these things? And no one knew how to do it. And then I found a class at the North Country Folk School that cost like $1,500 with a white lady weaving rush mats. And I was just like, that's our stuff, and that's where it hurts.
I think my opinion with how it affects Native people and Native communities is just that I'm always I work a lot with different Native communities, rural and in the city. And the number one thing that I see when I go into schools today that I have to kind of be armored before I go in is that most of the children I work with have a Native background, but they don't know what tribe they are. And so most of the Native educators that go into these places, we come in as kind of like just the older person, and we give them everything we know, because we want whatever they turn out to be or whatever they find, we want them to feel some sort of connection. And for me, when I was younger, I would ask, like, I'd always ask this all the time. I'd be in the cities, and we used to walk around in Northeast Minneapolis and kind of talk crap to other kids and be like, we would be in buckskins right now, but instead we're walking on cement. And it would be kind of like always this fantasy of how it could be. And I remember one of my earliest memories is one of my mother's friends telling us about what art meant to our people. It was a form of history making. It was a form of keeping our culture alive. We were the historians. We were everything. Our artists were, and it wasn't just a selected person. Everybody practiced art. And Western art now that is mostly known on Turtle Island, which is North America. Sometimes it can be exploitative, sometimes it can be for profit. I guess for me, I feel how it damages is that we have this belief that everything that we own, our language, and this is non-tangible things, our language, our way of life, our practice, our culture, our art forms, those don't belong to the current generation. Those belong to our children. Those are things that get passed down. They're the ones that hold the copyright. It's not really, and I can only speak for Dakotas. I can't speak for every other tribal nation because we all beautifully have different versions and variations, which is great. I feel like not one practice is above the other. We just do things differently. But for us, those people that hold that power and that hold that strength for us are our children. So when you are appropriating our designs, when you are appropriating our forms of art, you're taking away from a child. And I always like to share that's how we safeguard our things. And so things like, as most of you guys should know, I hope, is that Dakotas after 1863, we were, except for 4 bands in southern and central Minnesota, were exiled outside of our ancestral homelands. Most of us, including myself, belong to the Dakota diaspora. And so my tribe is in Sisseton, South Dakota, which is 4 hours northwest from here. 3.5 if you're me. But there's my grandmother was from Canada. Father was from Sisseton. I have family members that are from Standing Rock, North Dakota. And so we have this huge plethora of Dakota people that aren't being heard in Minnesota. Right now it's mainly just people that are here. And so there's a lot of unspoken truths that aren't being heard right now. But one of the main thing for Dakota people is because we were removed, when I was growing up on the reservation, I thought our traditional design was geometrics, like Lakota people, like Lakota plains. I was under the impression that it was that was like us. And it wasn't until my 20s that I found out that we had our own florals. It was 2007. My cousin and I were looking at these ancient Dakota floral designs, and he was telling me, he was like, X, Y, and Z, and da da da. And I remember asking one of my relatives about it, and they're like, yeah, because our art was the things that we loved. And florals, if you're moved from outside of your home territory and there's no florals, or there's no like anything like this in South Dakota or North Dakota, then how would it still be there? And so I remember after that, many artists like Marlena, and like other artists have done a remarkable job with revitalizing this almost lost art form. They've completely reignited it and completely given it back to the people. And so for pain to a place, and when somebody else starts appropriating that, then you feel almost duped. You feel like it's another form of being taken away from your home or taken away from those rights of your sovereignty, when people don't respect that. And so I kind of see it as that, and I really do feel like it's the main people that get hurt from it are artists, but I also feel that it is our children that do get the short end of the stick when it's constantly getting appropriated. And I feel like it's not just like we can only talk about these things because we're in the Midwest, but I know plenty of other tribes in the Northwest coast that have like larger mass production of sacred masks for the Tlinkits, for the Haida. It's on a larger scale, and those things are in like Indonesia. Those things are in like Jakarta. It's huge. It's huge tolls for those people. So we are only one little tiny sliver. We're only giving you one little tiny sliver of what's going on. It's a larger international scale that we're not aware of right now. And maybe one day we'll have that conversation with other tribes that are really feeling those effects. So the next question is, the native communities of Turtle Island have so many art forms. How does appropriation cause harm to your art that we are not aware of?
I think, as a contemporary artist, I have been on the judging panel for grants and stuff, and I see a lot of people applying, and a lot of non-native people, they want to like come into our communities and document what's happening there. Their grants, they talk about us as if we're just like not capable of telling our own stories. And I do know that there was a recent report put out, that the Minnesota State's Art Board, what was the numbers?
I forget the numbers. Pamela, what is the numbers?
$705 million over the last 10 years, and less than 1% of that made it into the hands of Native artists. And a lot of that money, we're still digging through it. A lot of that money was given to organizations that said they were representing Native artists, but not Native artists themselves. So we're working with the governor's office to change policy on how that legacy money has been distributed, because it's just downright shameful.
Yeah, so, Native artists were not funded in the application process. It's really hard for people to apply for. And they also put a limit on the state borders, so many Dakota people cannot apply. So say there's 5,000 Dakota people that live in Minnesota, and the 100,000 of us that don't live here, we can't apply for these things to tell our stories. And so there's even like an imbalance that more funding goes towards Ojibwe programming than Dakota programming, just because there are more Ojibwe people who are enrolled in the reservations are in Minnesota. So if I'm on a panel, if I'm on some sort of advisory, I try to bring up how the exile of Dakota people in 1862, how that is still affecting Dakota people today, and that we need to be supportive of our communities and not just look at the state border as where we draw the lines and where this money comes from, and also make sure that maybe even change the policy so that the designated amount always goes towards Native people, so that it isn't a struggle for us to get funding. Because if you go into any other country, if you go to Japan, you see Japanese art everywhere. But if you go to Minnesota, maybe you only see Native art in the Native galleries or something, or a Native section of something. So, I personally work on making my art visible everywhere, whether it's on a Target or a billboard or different murals around the cities, because I do think it's important that Native people are visible everywhere and not just in confined areas. But that's my thoughts. And Ashley?
I think that appropriation and artists who are appropriating our culture, like they're often perpetuating like the most basic version of it, like the most expected version of it, which props up like this idea that we exist like frozen in a historical place. And like I said earlier, I'm an installation artist, and so my work is weird and like doesn't always fulfill people's expectations of like what Native art should be, because a lot of those expectations have been created by artists who weren't actually rooted in Native culture. And so we're kind of like kept in this box. And I don't know, I think also like, there's the whole huge side that we haven't talked about, which is just like the economic side of things, that like so many people, when Native culture becomes an aesthetic, like our work is devalued, right? So like you have like a lot of really talented bead workers who make amazing things, and then you have people who just like see their work on Instagram and like are like suddenly have, a Native great grandmother, and then start selling their own beadwork. And because a lot of those like non-Native people or like marginally Native people might have, more capital, more connections, they're the ones who become elevated, right? So it makes things less interesting.
I guess for me, I feel like where appropriation causes harm in the art that I do is pretty much riffing off the same thing what Ashley was really trying to say about contemporary art. Historically in the US, we're probably up to only one generation of families that were in boarding school. I have aunts and uncles in their 60s that went to boarding school. In Canada, they've gotten reparations for boarding school, whereas the US has still yet to acknowledge. Right now, they're uncovering up to 10,000 bodies at mass graves at residential boarding schools. We have not even begun those searches right now. The closest boarding school to where I know would be in Pipestone, Minnesota, which is one of our sacred spaces for Dakota places, for Dakota people. But when it comes to, when you really understand where boarding school hit for us, it's understanding that reservations were POW camps. Reservations were places where we were not supposed to leave the reservation. It wasn't until way later when we were allowed. This was our third panelist that was supposed to be here. Obviously, he's not sick. Yeah. And so when you think about those sort of stuff where boarding schools were places, it was homogenized. We were not supposed to practice our language. We were not supposed to practice our culture. We were not supposed to practice any of those things. So when you think about where history hit us, you also have to correlate that in the 1930s, a person named Dorothy Dunn, who is from Santa Fe, New Mexico, started this Dorothy Dunn painting school, and she was teaching the Indians an aesthetic, a made-up aesthetic of what curators and collectors, curators or anthropologists, what they wanted to see. She was telling the Indian children, create a scene with a pony, with a bonnet, being in a landscape area. It was to the T of what they wanted. There's other stories of the 7 Apache prisoners in Colorado that they were being exploited by a prison guard, and that guard was taking their art and turning profits off of their art. So this isn't something new. We had a traditional form of art. For Dakota people, it was floral, it was painting, it was ceramics, it was a number of stuff. Anything could be turned into art. Same thing with Anishinaabe people. So you go from having culture, then you go into being restricted to have culture, and then you go to what to create. That was in the 1930s. So then it created this whole genre of the art that they wanted to see. So then we come up to the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, which is, I'm not going to ruin it because that was the next question. Sometimes things are created not in the benefit for the people it's supposed to be for. Sometimes it's created for other reasons, I should say that. So I wanted to go back to Marlena because this question was really for different art forms, and I feel like Marlena has a lot of perspective on what's going on currently with digital art, because we also have to look at the licensing. A lot of artists don't understand that places like Teton Company, clothing company, or places like what's the other one? Pendleton, those are non-native companies that make big profits off of native people. But when they do bring in a native artist, just like my mother, they don't know their rights. They don't know that there's any sort of licensing. They don't understand that they really need to read contracts. And Marlena, I feel, is when we were thinking about people that should be a part of this panelist, I thought of Marlena because she's in my mind, one of the big hitters, because she really understands who she's going to go into it, who she's going to work with. She's the type of person that actually reads where the stuff goes. Whereas other people want to do the quick fashion and will send their designs to China, and then those don't have any copyright. Those are not protected. Those can be exploited elsewhere. So I just want to kind of give up some of my space and kind of bring it back to you, because I feel like you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is protecting traditionally what people like my mom would do beadwork, and there are some native artists who will take a beadwork pattern and print it on fabric and then have it made in China and sold to a lot of people. And I feel like that diminishes the work of, handmade items. And I think, as a native artist, you want to protect what people are doing by hand. As a digital artist, especially, it's kind of, some people can easily imitate something done by hand traditionally and mass produce it. And I think as a native person, you want to make sure you don't disenfranchise your own people, trying to make a profit for yourself. Some people get too much into this hustle mentality and they want to turn, a small amount of money into big amount of money. And you got to keep your traditional values, like generosity. When I work with like a large corporation, I tell them there are laws that my tribes have that protect what I create. The work I create is copyrighted by my own people, so I can't sell you that copyright, and I don't want to. I can license it to you, and you can use it that way. And I'm going to make sure nothing I give you is, like related to the ceremony or something like that. And it is important to read the contracts. Like, a lot of people will change the contract. I worked with like the DNR, and it took forever for them to like approve the contract. But I'm like, if you want to move forward, and there's not many other artists like me that you can work with, and you're just gonna have to go through this process with me. Like, they'll have the patience if they really want to work with you, and you're creating something that they can't find other places. That's something that you have to push with that organization and change the way they think. And I do try to reach out to other artists who work with like Teton Trade Cloth. They're owned by a Native person now, just because there was a big controversy, and then the people who owned it started shopping around to different tribes to try to get a tribe to buy it, and then one finally did. So then the Lenape people, the Delaware tribe, they own it now. So at least that solves that problem. And it was because the Native community spoke up, and they basically canceled this company, because they were disrespectful towards women who spoke up about the abuse they had, and I find that's really powerful that the Native people can hold these non-Native organizations accountable. And I'm just one person that tries my best, but I saw on Facebook, all people come together, and I think that starts opening the community's eyes to the problems that we have as even an artist or as consumers. The people who are buying from this company, they no longer would purchase from them. And there was like other Native fabric designers that stepped up and said that, they normally produce their own in-house designs made by their own Native person that owns it, but then they said they don't see other Native designers as competition. So they were offering these artists to make money because for like my friends who were working with Teton Trade Cloth, that was a big significant income for them. And they told them, like, I'm taking my design back. I don't want you producing it because you don't support Native women by the comments made by the person who owned it, and they had the integrity to, turn down a financial opportunity to protect our community. And other Native organizations stepped up to help these people. And that to me was like a beautiful outcome. And it's not just reading contracts, but also how our tribes can still work as a. But the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, a lot of people don't even know what that is. And like, they'll do a call for Native artists, and I tell them, this person isn't really Native in the sense that what a Native artist is. And they're like, well, we meant Indigenous artists. And I'm like, well, what's your intent then? Was your intent to honor the lands, the stories that are here in Minnesota? Then make sure that's the intent. Don't start changing it just because this artist you wanted to work with is big name, their name's in a newspaper all the time or something. Like, don't start changing what the rules were just because you want to work with someone that applied. Make sure your intent is always followed through. And for me, I respect these kind of organizations that see the mistakes they made and are willing to listen. And we give them people like Miniba or like the Minnesota Native Artists Alliance, people they can reach out to and take the classes you guys provide that can kind of open how organizations can work with the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, because I don't want to spend hours of my time educating them on the law. I'm not a lawyer. And I feel like it's their job to, once they're made aware, correct the problems they've made, and also don't just cancel the project. I've had people that do that too. You bring up the problem and they get scared and like, how do you just cancel it? And I'm like, that benefited nobody, and it wasted my time to tell you about this if I feel like I'm just going to be penalized for bringing up issues. So, there's times it works out great, and other times, I feel like you've taken 10 steps backwards in this process. So, as a contemporary artist, I'll keep doing what I do and try to make sure I can support the community whenever I'm put into like a position of power or conversation with places. Even if it doesn't work out for me, I want to make sure they've had this information presented to them. So going forward, they know there's good ways of working with the Native community.
Which leads me into the next question is, what is the Indian Arts and Crafts Act and how effective is it? You don't have to like go over like by verbatim, or what was your experience with it?
Maybe you're saying I never get to use my.
I was going to say, maybe should explain what the act is.
I never get to use my federal Indian policy education.
Okay, then we'll start it off with Ashley.
So the Indian Arts and Crafts Act basically is it's like champagne, right? Like it's only an Indian art if it's made by an Indian, which to the federal government is a federally enrolled, indigenous person. It's a great idea. I think there's a lot of complications, obviously, like I talked about before with identity. But I think the main problem with it is that there's just literally like no enforcement at all. I think Pamela's on a one-woman mission to try to get that to change. But like I've been fighting and like reporting things for Indian arts and crafts violations like on Etsy for the past 20 years, like since Etsy existed, and it happens all the time. And it sometimes happens, a lot of the truth at the heart of a lot of this too is so many families in the US have lied about their identities. Like so many people who think that they have like native blood just don't. Like it was a way, that people covered up like being black, a way that they covered up being immigrants, was to claim that they had indigenous heritage. And so that's like a part that you have to reckon with when you talk about like who's violating it and things like that, right? So some people are violating it without like a bad intent, but lots of people are willingly and openly violating it with very bad intent just to make a profit, right? So enforcement is a big part, but I would say like the worst actors aren't the small ones. Like the worst actors are huge companies. I saw a squash blossom fake necklace like on Shein the other day. Like this is like Navajo silverwork that like is like beautiful, that like people, there's like just generations of history in this jewelry, and you can like go buy it on Shein for like $10, like a copy of an actual artist's piece, right? And that happens all the time. Like fast fashion is like the worst appropriator out of everybody. And then even there's like another kind of whole weird appropriation that's happening now where like companies like Nike hire actual native artists to design things, and then those native artists use like sacred symbols and stuff from other cultures that aren't theirs. Like me being indigenous doesn't mean that I get to use like Dakota designs and call them my own. Like, so there's just so many layers to it. But yeah, overall, Indian Arts and Crafts Act, I would say D-. Great.
Yeah, and I'd have to agree with that, because I feel like as a Native person, when you're first starting out, you think of policies as being the superhero, right? But Indian Arts and Crafts Act and most of the policies, I would say, in the U.S. are not that. So there are places like the Santa Fe Indian Market, is very much similar to the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. Santa Fe Indian Market really created guidelines for people that were selling their art, and they were authenticating those pieces for collectors. So the Santa Fe Indian Market was saying, if you are going to participate, the items that you are using need to be pure turquoise, pure coral, pure fibrous, and we call them place-based art. So if you are a Navajo or Dene artist from Arizona and you create works with sand paintings and with turquoise, that's called place-based art. If Ashley decided to do rush mats, again, from White Earth, that's place-based art. That's where you would find that art. And so what the Indian Arts and Crafts Act is kind of similar is that what they were saying is that these collectors wanted to collect things, but when you go into a museum, the main thing that they do when they acquire art is they do a provenance of where that art piece comes from. And they want a certificate that this is authentically made by a Hopi artist. This is authentically made by an Anishinaabe artist. So that was initially created for collectors. So where it's not strong. It's just like NAGPRA. NAGPRA is a big one for us as well. That's where we can repatriate sacred items and remains that were wrongly, dug up by colleges and by institutions and what have you. But even with NAGPRA, there's a loop, and for Indian Arts and Crafts Act, there's a major loop, because you can create, let's say Amber decides that she is going to create a traditional Lakota buckskin. Amber can sell it if she puts that she is not Native American and that this is Native inspired. So the Indian Arts and Crafts Act is there, but it's not protective. What it will prosecute is if Amber is saying she is Pine Ridge or she's Oglala Lakota citizen, and she is enrolled and she's making these buckskin dresses and she's competing for funding in these places, that's where Amber will get prosecuted. Maybe because it's $1,000 fine for institutions, for galleries, for universities if they don't abide by those things. So the Indian Arts and Crafts Act will prosecute, and there's been places where they've successfully done and places where they haven't been so successful. But I feel like with a non-Native judicial system, I feel like that judicial system is really more or less on the victim's side, where not on the victim's side, where it's the victim that has to prove there's been something done wrong. And that's what this act really is. As a Native person, we have to put in the time. It's time that you're never going to get back. It's time that is just like this bucket that has a hole at the bottom and it goes all the way into the earth and it burns up in the middle of the earth. It's all this time that you put in to prove that there was an unjust. But it's a 50-50 if they're going to get prosecuted. I feel like with the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, I believe in it, and I want to educate more people. Obviously, the Minnesota Native Artists Alliance, we do educate in that. We have lawyers. We're not the direct one. We partner, just like with NEMA, we partner with other people, with lawyers and with educators, because it does get kind of taxing when you're constantly explaining this. But I guess I feel that I will always want hope in the human race, and it feels like a pageantry of like Miss Universe, where I'm like, what do you really want? World peace. What do I really want? Be a good human. You shouldn't have to have a law to say, hey, I'm going to profit and make this dream catcher. It's not from my people, but I saw it somewhere. It's okay for me to do it. I guess for me, I just believe that people can really find in themselves to make better choices, especially in the arts. And I guess Ashley brought up this point of what happened with the Walker scaffold with Sam Durant, who didn't just appropriate the Dakota narrative, but he also appropriated women and Black history and other histories and kind of made this hodgepodge. And with that, it's like, well, how is he breaking da 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 da? And I guess I'm like, well, why would you do that? Why would it be okay to appropriate or take somebody else's story and get millions of dollars? Like, as an artist, I'm never gonna be that $1.2 million artist that makes this money on doing this da da da, nor would I ever want to. Because when you get to that level, and this is just me preaching, but I want to always be a part of my community. I always want to be connected to my people. And I'm not saying money is bad, because obviously it's really the person that's spending it. But I guess I don't want to put all my bets on the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. I just want people to just stop and make their best judgment instead of being told not to do something.
Crazy. Can I just have a 30-second response to that?
Yeah.
It might be 1 minute. Okay. I think that the thing is like Graci's hope of like people should just stop doing this. I think in order to get there, you have to actually acknowledge that there is a reason why mostly white people appropriate. And it's because whiteness is the destruction of all y'all's culture. Like, and people have to have culture. Like people, we are social creatures. We have to have ways of relating to each other. We have to have cultural traditions, or we feel an emptiness. And so whiteness creates a vacuum that has to be filled by something. And so that's why you get like, white people who are like, oh, I swear I was Native in a past life. Like they feel a longing for culture that is valid. And like that is what whiteness has done, has erased your ancestors. That's so sad to me. I cannot imagine living in a way where I don't feel connected to my ancestors. And like when you're removed from your homelands, you've erased your culture to buy into and get power from whiteness, you are going to yearn for something else. And so until that can also be addressed, like until white supremacy can be really addressed, appropriation can't really go away because people need culture.
Do you have anything to say about Indian Arts and Crafts Act?
I mean, I think if you rely on the government to get you anywhere in life, you're never going to get anywhere in life. So, I mean, you as a consumer, buy from Native artists, support Native art. You're going to have to be proactive. Native people, I've seen it time and time again. We have a capitalistic society, and if people say, we're going to cancel this company, that company immediately changes things because it cares about profits at the end of the day. And so consumers, you have a power. Cancel culture can be kind of bad, but it can also be kind of good. So I think the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, we can't really rely on that to do a lot for Native people. I think you as consumers will have to support Native artists. States' public funding has to change and go directly to artists. But there's a funny story about appropriation, though, and how long this has been going on. People think it's like a modern day thing, but I was looking in the Library of Congress and I typed in like Sitting Bull, and I saw there was a book within like 5 years after he died. Some lady in Massachusetts, some white woman, said his ghost came to her and narrated this whole book in English to her about his vision for all people. And I'm just like, wow, this has been going on for so long that Sitting Bull suddenly knew English and didn't come to any Native person or anything. He went to a woman in Boston and she had this whole book she says it's written by Sitting Bull, and it was narrated to her from his ghost. And I thought that was the craziest thing I've ever seen. So. I'm going
to do that for Andrew Jackson. It's going to be
Andrew Jackson said he's sorry. He told me this. So we want to leave some time to obviously answer some questions, but we do have one last question that I would really love to ask. And that is, Do you feel cultural appropriation is a form of racism and oppression?
I mean, definitely. I've seen people appropriate our culture, and they literally say they are an expert in our culture. They know it better than we know it, and that they should be the ones who create this art form to tell it. You know, they didn't grow up with our traumas. They didn't grow up with like generational knowledge. They didn't grow up with their parents creating this art or telling them these stories. They basically went into a reservation, took these stories, and when they apply for things, they literally say, you know, I know these things better than the people who, you know, these things came from. And it also, I feel, is harmful to Native people who didn't get the chance to have these ceremonial experiences, who didn't get the chance to have these stories and knowledge taught to them because of like boarding schools, that these people can come in and just, you know, become the expert. It's like they appropriate our culture for so long that are they now Native American more than I am or something? It's insane that I feel like that's how Native people will be erased if people like that can continue to get funding and opportunities not meant for them.
I was trying to think about how I could use that question to rant about capitalism next, but no, I mean, I think I just said, right, that like, I think that appropriation exists because white supremacy exists, and white supremacy obviously is tied to racism, like the structural ways that we are oppressed by white domination. My mom's half white, just so you, I mean, my mom's white, like, it's fine. Like, one side of me really brings the other down. Like, it's been a long day. No, so, I mean, I think that, I think there's something interesting about appropriation and consent. And I was talking the other day about how much, like, Native Twitter is constantly at war with vegan Twitter. Like, the vegans are all like, you guys can't hunt whales, you can't hunt deer, you can't eat rabbits. And we're like, why are you talking to us? And I tweeted the other day, I was just like, dude, like, you killed off 80% of our relatives. Like, let us have this. Like, let us just keep these traditions that we've held on to. Like, be a decent person. And I think that that's it. There is a theft. There's something that is a removal of this agency we have and that we've preserved when people take what is ours. And that is violence. Yeah. Also, capitalism is really bad.
We're going back to there. Okay. Racism and oppression. I feel like when it comes to appropriation, just personally from my stance, I didn't realize how the public schools really worked for Native people and for people of color, especially students of color, and how problematic it is in the long run for us. That pretty much you're only given one history perspective, and the rest is kind of extracurricular when you get into college, if you even get to that point. And I guess when I work with kids, there was a whole curriculum that we kind of made up with the Hennepin County Library, where we did this little toy theater, and the kids they read about mascots and appropriation and how it affects Native communities. And I remember sitting there, how do I explain how harmful this is to kids? And because it's really not their fault, it's what's being taught to them, what they're conditioned to be. And I started to think about, how do you explain something that's racist to a child? Because they don't really understand that just yet, or students of color understand it. And so I started to really think, like, deep dive it, and started to read about it. And an explanation that was just kind of the chef's kiss was that it was hurtful. It hurts my feelings when you dress up like me. It feels like you're mocking me. And so that was the activity with these kids. Was it hurts my feelings when my grandmother lost her mother, and she was boarding school along with all my aunts, and my mother was Christian, a holy roller, one of the biggest ones, and she didn't start connecting until the late 70s, and she ran away at 16. And if it wasn't for her work in connecting us back into our traditions, I would have probably been raised in that same cycle. And I'm very much happy that I don't know anything about the church. I don't know when a man refers to a woman as his rib, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know those things, and I'm really thankful, because the other part of it is that our churches back then on the res were mostly done in our language. So I grew up going to church with my grandma, but the whole Bible was in Dakota. And because Dakota isn't my first language anymore, I didn't understand what they were saying. So I totally didn't, I was like the worst person there. So, well, probably the best person there. But in retrospect, it hurts my feelings when I see somebody, for instance, that goes to a Dakota language classes, and they pick up my language really fast. And then they come to me and they flex how much they know about my language and about my people. It hurts my feelings when my people who were raised in a boarding school put these people up on a pedestal and they say they're the best type of Dakota representation around. It hurts my feelings when somebody thinks that they have access to my culture and they don't respect that I am still a hurt person. So when I talk to children, I try to keep that in mind. I try to explain to them what racism really looks and how does it really impact. Because I feel like when you're fighting against all of this stuff, you start to get desensitized. And the really root of it is that you're hurt by it. And you're tired of being hurt by it. It gets draining. And you're tired of then having children and them generationally getting hurt by it. Or other children generationally getting hurt by it. So, sorry about that, my feelings. We would really love to hear your questions. No question is a dumb question, I would like to say, but there are some dumb questions. So I would like to ask Pamela, my trustee leader, Pamela, if you wouldn't mind passing around the mic to ask for people. And she's super agile. Just give her some time to go through the row. The rows are really tight, so raise your hand and just be patient.
Yeah, I'll do a double backflip. I'm really good at that.
Was Scott Seekins ever held accountable for his work?
He was not.
Okay.
And I was so mad when I was at the McKnight Foundation the other day and they had one of his pieces up. I was like, how dare you hang that next to a Jim Dunham painting? Okay, sorry.
And then also, what do you think of the Mardi Gras Indians who incorporate Pocahontas in their beadwork and other symbols that are disrespectful?
Man, I really struggle with the Mardi Gras Indians. Like, I wish they didn't use our names. Like, they use actual tribal names in their different troops. But I feel like it's not related to us beyond that. So, like, if they would just stop that part, like, no, I mean, the actual material culture of it isn't related. Like, it's so far away from our traditions that, like, it's a different thing. And also, it's not black people in New Orleans that are hurting our people. It's just not. Like, I think the name thing is disrespectful, but that they're not my biggest concern.
Yeah, I think that there's some things that we can speak to and some things that we can't. I can't personally speak to. I would like to say that I'm going to go off on a tangent. I can just feel it. So I'm just going to say I'm just going to go on to the next question, because there is a history with that, and it does pertain a lot to removal of Native people in Connecticut that were, darn it. No, I'm going to feel it. I feel it coming on.
It's fine.
Oh, okay. Yes, go on to the next question, because there's a whole history.
Hi, my name is Brittany. I'm Little Shell descendant over here. My grandmother is also a survivor. She went to St. Joseph's, which if a lot of people don't realize, that is a school that is still open. It's actively open, and it seeks donations, so do not donate to them, please. This question is specifically to Ashley because you are Ojibwe, and my tribe is Ojibwe as well. How do you feel about dream catchers? Because that is considered a closed practice in Anishinaabe culture, but other natives, because there was the pan-native movement that happened in the 60s and 70s, kind of adopted it, and then it just got taken over by everyone, and you can get like the little unicorn ones now too, and with the little yarn pieces, which are gross.
So I will say that I've made the personal choice to let dream catchers go. Like, to let my anger about it go, because it was like too toxic for me to have to encounter and deal with all the time. Like, if I got mad every time I saw a dream catcher, I would be mad all of the time. And so I hate it. I hate that it's popular. I hate that people think it's just like anything, like, there's like this kind of native design that I call like the Portlandia school of native design, where you just like slap an eagle feather on something and it's native. And people are the same way about dream catchers. They're like, just put a dream catcher on it, it's fine. But I think there's a deeper point here about dream catchers where, like, when people were deeply removed from our culture, when they had either been adopted out, they had been stolen, they had been wherever displaced, we lost teachings. But like the material, there's something, so I don't like it when non-native people are doing it, but like I grew up making dream catchers like in native, like the native programs in the Minneapolis public schools. And so part of me is like, we held on to something because it was important. But like, it's sad that we don't have most people don't have the teachings that go with it. And so actually, like, one of the ways I stopped being angry about it is it's just kind of funny. Like, we make them for babies. And it's like a thing that you don't do past when someone's in a cradle board. And so it's kind of silly just to see adults going around acting like big babies. And also, it's like, it's not like people think it's like a good thing, but it's not. Like, you don't want to touch a dream catcher. Like, it's blocking you from like bad things. So like tattooing it on your body just doesn't actually make sense. So now I feel pity, which is the good Ojibwe value for those people.
There's a thing like where we don't want to use, some artists don't want to use something because it's become too mainstream or taken from us, but one of my fellow artists, Keith Braveheart, he still puts eagle feathers in all of his works because he says it's important to us still as a people. So like if dream catchers are important to like, the children, I feel like we should still be able to, or you should still be able to claim that as your culture and not just let it be completely taken from us. So like I'd never really created many works with feathers in it just because I thought a lot of people think of Native people as like leather feathers and beads, but listening to Keith talk about that, I realize it's important for our own people to see our own symbolism still. It doesn't really, we can kind of ignore what mainstream is doing. We don't always have to be doing things in defense of what's being taken from us.
Oh, I also don't want to come off like I'm insulting feathers on being on things. It's more about like the laziness of some people who are just like, blah, put a bird on it.
We have a question over here.
We have a question from the Zoom chat. What is your defining factor between cultural appropriation and appreciation?
Did a Native person make it?
I mean, appreciation, you bought it from a native person and they made it for market, you know, they made it to sell to you. It's something that they want you to own and feel proud to own, you know, and that's what appreciation is.
Yeah, and I think Ashley answered it really well. Was it a native person that made it? Because obviously we just said the whole scenario, if there's a way to get around the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, and we don't want you to go around the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. We want you to respect our boundaries. I know Pamela hates it when we talk about boundaries, because there's better ways to explain that. But I think it really is. I have non-native relatives, and because they know I do so much with appropriation, and somebody will give them moccasins and they won't like let their children wear it or anything like that. And we had this long discussion, and I was like, if I make my nieces moccasins, I want them to wear it, you know. Or if you're gonna buy earrings, this is native made. If you're gonna buy earrings from a native person, make sure it's a native person. It's okay. You can appreciate us in a way. You're helping our economy here. You're helping families, and don't try to buy them from the same. Yeah. Like, let us keep our good viewers. Yeah. You guys can buy from like the third tier. Yeah.
We reserve the right to not tell you where our earrings came.
Hi. So I am very rudely white and also a design historian. And one of the things that I find is an issue is when I'm antiquing, especially for photographs, I collect antique photographs. When I recognize that the history of a photograph is very problematic, I'm wondering your opinion on, like, I've talked to people who say, well, if you understand what it is and you're holding it until you find a place for it to go, then it's right. But then others who say, just leave it. What are your thoughts about white people basically taking antiques that are problematic when they know the history?
I mean, it depends. Like, if you own a pipe, maybe give it back to that tribe. Or if it is something even more problematic, still give it back to the tribe and let them decide if they want to destroy it or put it on display. There are museums returning objects they stole from people who died during the Wounded Knee Massacre, you know, and it's up to the tribe if they want to make replica of certain things and put them on display, or if they want to give it to the families, if they want to bury it, whatever they want to do, you know. I think just give it back to the tribes and let them decide.
Yeah, and I can't say, I mean, I have grandfathers that were photographed, and this was clearly during the time where it was illegal for us to go off the res and it was illegal for us to hunt. And one of my grandfathers was photographed with wearing a large cross, Christ crossed, white cutout Christ crossed. And this was like maybe the last few years of his life, so you could just see that he's just completely drained, you know. And I think that it's a good call to just give it back. If this was if in this scenario, that wasn't this picture is on the internet, it's all over the place. But if there's ever an opportunity where you come across something, finding the provenance of what nation it comes from, it gives them the agency. You're allowing them, like, you can't, when somebody does something horrible to you, you're never going to get an apology, right? You're just as an adult, you realize that sometimes we teach our kids to say sorry. Sometimes you're not going to get that. And sometimes when you don't get that, that's not the path. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're a healed person. It's great, but sometimes you don't get it. Stuff like that, it gives agency to those tribes to decide what they're going to share to the world, their history, what they want to do with it if they choose, because there is a large drive right now for different tribes to have their own cultural centers and their own cultural museums. We have Native art professionals now that curate our own art. They have relationships with Native artists, and they understand in those relationships who these artists are, and they go to those people. So it's a whole subculture that has been a long time in the making. So even at that, giving them that opportunity to have that in their collections and they can choose what they do with it is the best thing you can do. A good example of that, the Mdewa tribe, which is also known as Shakopee, they just came out with their first museum. You all should go to it, because if you're Minnesotan, this is your history. Because this is the ancestral people. They have on view right now the handcuffs of that were from the women, children, and elders that were held in the concentration camp that's at Fort Snelling. These were handcuffs that were taken from that. They had that choice on what they were going to do, and they decided that they wanted people like you all to know the history of where you're at. And so that's on display. And so that is a good example of giving people an opportunity to know and to decide on what they choose to share.
Just a quick logistics thing though about that. As people, both Graci and I have worked on Franklin Avenue in the American Indian Cultural Corridor, you will not be the first awkward white person to come in and hand us something and be like, I found this and I don't know what to do. We've done it a million times. So like that is a very easy solution, is just like give it to like an actual like Native organization, find Pamela. But, drive out to Shakopee. We've all gotten like some little awkward little bag. The funniest thing is when they're like 1940s, like roadside random trash, and someone's like, this was in my grandma's box, and it's so sweet, and you're like, this is so weird. It's really awkward.
Yeah, and I should say the weirdest and most fascinating thing that's ever happened to my aunt was there was a non-Native person who was friends with an Anishinaabe person, and in the middle of northern Minnesota they found a headdress in trees, and when they saw it, they didn't know what to do with it, and it looked like it was just pony beads. It looked like it was just they didn't know what to do with it, so they gave it to my aunt. And my aunt had this headdress under her bed in a box for like a year, because she was like, I don't know like where this came from. And we actually found out it was it was a headdress from one of the captives from the Dakota 38. And that he wanted, oh man, I don't know why I'm so emotional. He wanted to dye Dakota, and he wanted to look Dakota. So he took anything he could get his hands on, feathers, beads, leather, and he created his own makeshift feather headdress. And we don't know, to this day, nobody knows how this headdress made it to northern central Minnesota in the middle of nowhere. Nobody understood that, but it made its way back to us, and we're so like stuff like that, like just getting emotional and talking about it, stuff like that. Whatever you come to find, and if you can just like give it back, it's like just precious to us. It's those moments where it's like connects us to that history, that no matter what, we were just not afraid, and all we wanted to be was ourselves.
I was just going to add a quick thing. What they were saying about giving it to like a Native arts organization is a really good thing to do. But the other thing is they would know how to get a hold of the tribal preservation historic officers at the nations. That would probably be the best place to take something like that, because they would be able to look at it. That's their job, and they watch over those things. Like when we say return it to the tribe, you could call the office and go, where do I give this back? And you may get passed around through the whole nation. And so I'm just giving you like a second thing, like talk to a Native arts organization, and maybe the organization can help you find. But we could call the TIPO, we call them TIPO officers. That's the abbreviation for Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. So, and I'll get the microphone for you.
Can I ask a question?
She's before you.
Hi. I just want to say thank you. This is an extremely important conversation to have. I've been getting emotional this whole time. But I wanted to know from you what this conversation means to you and what it means for you to have this platform, to have this conversation in a room full of white people and other indigenous folks as well.
I mean, that's the first thing I sat down and asked Ashley. I'm like, what do you think all these like non-native people showed up here to hear, you know, like, and then she had a really great response that maybe that maybe they want to police other white people for us, you know, once they hear what we heard, and they're going to go out and do it. So then I don't have to do the emotional energy. I don't have to spend all day on Twitter fighting people, you know, like sometimes I enjoy doing that, but I have things to do, I think, at this point. So, I mean, I can't really know what you are here to do, but I just want to share my perspective, and hear too from these two, their perspectives as well, and learn from them. And then people at home, you know, I think they're hearing a lot of different information they might not have heard. They might have thought appropriation was something very simple or something very minor, but you know, it kind of has its roots into everything, and it's complex. There's no easy solution, but I think just listening and having these truths being told, no matter how hard they are or how emotional they are, I think that's a good start and a good place to be.
I'll be honest, like, if it wasn't Graci that asked me to do this and Pamela, like, I don't really like talking about appropriation. I just put like a lot of my personal family trauma like on display for y'all in a way that hopefully makes it more memorable for you to understand like why it's painful, but like is also really emotionally taxing on me. So my Venmo is ZIIBIING. Marlena can give out hers too. Graci's got kids. You can just give her cash. Like, it is tiring. It is exhausting. And honestly, like, there's so much more that I want to talk to you about. Like, I think Marlena and I, we're like together, like the weird, cool digital native people. Like, we've got so many cool shit. Like, the things she's doing with like augmented reality are so dope. And like, we have so many cool things we could talk to you about. And we have to talk about this. And that sucks. And like, I want you to come back for the next conversation. I want you to learn this, and I want you to ask more. I want you to be curious about Native art and like learn more about like our work and buy Native artists' work, you know? But like, it really is just exhausting. Because it's such a base thing. It's such a base thing to be like, can you just respect us as people? But you know, also, maybe there is some hope. Maybe you guys can all save us some energy.
Yeah, and I guess like in being friends with both of these two people, Ashley had a really great installation art piece this past summer at Northern Spark, and it was imagining the future instead of a dystopia, a utopia. And when I went to her piece, I got inspired from her art, and I started to think, that's how we should be looking at climate change. Is what if we actually got our stuff together? What if we actually made this change? How could that look? And so coming from that and totally being inspired by it, I started to think, when we started to dream up Art Back, I thought, what if we actually made it? What if it just stopped? You know, we already have some big wins with other, you know, prominent cases that have happened. Teton tray cloth I did not know about. I just got back on Facebook.
Me here, I can finally buy my black jingle.
Yeah, like this, I got back on Facebook 2 weeks ago, I think, and like I didn't know about that, so I'm like, that's a win for us. Minnetonka moccasins, they've made some change. They've talked to really great and phenomenal Anishinaabe artists, Adrian Benjamin, to come on to help them kind of readjust everything with them and dream up their future. And so for me, it's like, I think since 2004 and fighting cultural appropriation with our ceremonies, our sacred ceremonies, and hearing so many cases of women and children that were totally violated, and now being an artist and doing my stuff and really engaging in what I was meant to be here, and then also seeing that there's appropriation with art and that we're fighting it all the time, I started to get the same way where I'm like, I'm really tired of educating. Being at the Walker scaffold, when we first went there, we were there to tear it down. But by the fourth day of being there, we found ourselves protecting it because we had a lot of white supremacists that were showing up, that were trying to take pieces of it so it wouldn't die. That was like, it was like the weirdest thing to go to there to stop something and create protest flyers for it, and then be there at night, and then also have like the arts community people. Like, I always thought I was going, like, my dream job, I knew I was going to go into museum studies, and my dream job was supposed to be at Walker. I think 3 months prior to the scaffold, I was like doing speakings with them, panel discussions with them, and I thought, oh, they're finally seeing me. What if like they're gonna just see my application and my CV, and they're gonna want me to work with them because I know what, like, I've paid for this. And then knowing that arts community that I heavily rely on, I know that there's artists in the audience right now, to know that there was so much hate to the Dakota and Native community for saying stop, and getting all this backlash that you're trying to censor art. That's not what art is. Really tormented me. And so because of that, and in all this sort of hate, I want to change it into something else. What if it's other people from other nations that start to educate instead of us always having to do it? What if with cooperation and with intersectionality, what if we actually accomplish that? How is that gonna look? How beautiful would that really be? Where maybe my kids' generation, maybe my grandkids' generations that we haven't even seen yet, what if we actually accomplish that? How is that actually going to be? Because in our minds, we think that it's not obtainable, right? But it did exist. It did exist before. It has existed before. It's only been in the last, 100 years where it's now a problem. So given that, it can change. It really can. So I guess that was my whole reasoning on working for MNAA. My whole reasoning and being here today is because I don't want to give too much energy to this. I want to give energy into hoping that there's just going to be more action taken by the community, by fellow artists that are going to have our backs. And that's kind of, I was thinking about, I'm like, art back. Well, you can have our backs too. You don't have to just like speak on our behalf, but you can have our backs and say, I looked up this, da da da, you know. And so I guess that's my reasoning for it.
Oh, wait, is this on? Yeah. I feel like that was such a beautiful way to end. I just want to stay with that thought, and I'll ask my question another time.
Is there another question? Oh, you have another one?
Even though I feel like your message that you just ended on would be the most awesome thing to take from this panel. I do have a couple more questions in the chat. What types of appropriation are discussed the most within your community, and what types are discussed the least?
Most Halloween costumes, probably. Least, I think the inter-native appropriation thing is a really interesting one. There's some also complicated stuff about class, where like natives who are better resourced, we don't like to talk about like rich native people or like native people with privilege, but there's definitely people who have capitalized on the privilege they have, and like basically stolen art from people who weren't able to put their work out into the world in the same way. So I don't know, that's just probably lots of other things.
I mean, I probably hang in different circles. So for me, the thing I hear most is like people elevating non-native people as the expert in our culture. And then if there's someone who's equally qualified who is native, other people just put them down. They constantly attack the native person for some reason, and they respect the non-native person. So that's something I hear people who experience that personally, or I hear people talking about how it's always happening. And for me, I never hear people talking about Halloween costumes anymore, maybe because I don't personally have kids, so I just don't hang out with, I don't know, people who talk about Halloween costumes. So.
I'm just on Twitter too much. And so it was just Halloween, it's Thanksgiving this week, there's a lot of costume conversations.
Yeah.
I spend like very little time on Twitter, like native Twitter, so.
Yeah. And I feel like we do have more questions, but the other thing about this, the beautiful thing about this, is that with this partnership with NEMA, we are planning to do this again, and we want to do this again. We want this to be, because NEMA has many artists that work with NEMA. And we just got done with Art Attack, and Art of World is going to be coming up in May. So I'm interested into seeing how that's going to look. I know that the whole premise of my conversation with Anna was Art Attack just got done, and the first thing I said, and I'm not too much of like I don't think I'm a controversial person. Like I can just breathe through conversations. But one of the things I told her was, this native family went to Art of World and they saw that there was some appropriated native designs and appropriated native art that was in there. Then these were people that were non-native. And when that happens, you might think that we get angry, but we see that as a form of racism. And we also see it, as soon as you see it, it's an unsafe place to be, because it's a bold act for us. When I go into somewhere, even though I'm not Anishinaabe, I go into some place and there's a person that obviously isn't native and they're selling dream catchers, I automatically feel unsafe, because that's Mnisota for you. We are in the deep north. We are more racist than the deep south, unfortunately, and statistically proven. And so because of that, it's unsafe. It's unsafe for native families. It's unsafe for anybody participating with it. So I guess what an outcome for that would be is if we can educate more and have these discussions of other art forms, because Miko not being here tonight was really kind of a missed opportunity, because he works in the performance arts, and performance arts is a whole gamut of things that we're not talking about. And so there will be future panels where we'll be talking about this, and it's going to be an ongoing thing. So I think it's safe to say we can save those questions for the next ones. Do you want to do one more?
Oh, okay. I thought
You're done?
Okay.
Gracie, hold on. You should also follow MNAA on all social media, on Facebook, and watch Graci every month as she interviews really interesting native artists and talks to them and drinks tea. You could learn something every month.
Yes.
Make a donation.
So thank you everybody for coming, and thank you Marlena, thank you Ashley. Please look for their names, support their work. Marlena's doing a lot of public art pieces, as well as Ashley. Please support the things that they do and support other Native artists as well. So, Dokshta Ake, have a good night.